For the first time in over 20 years, Australians will be asked to vote in a referendum.
On a remote patch of land on Yolngu country, history is being made.
I believe the momentum is with us as never before. I believe this country is ready for this reform. If not now, when?
The proposed changes come down to 3 sentences to be added to the nation's founding document. 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, that voice may make representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice.
The Albanese government wants this body to formally advise Parliament, and it insists it must have constitutional standing. Now, you probably have so many questions, but disappointingly, the government has failed to answer them.
There has been 10 years of expert advisory groups, of parliamentary groups, of discussions with constitutional lawyers, of discussions with First Nations people. There is a lot of information already in the public arena. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, there is a lot of information out there, but much of it is conflicting. Australians need to know before they vote what the specific model the government has in mind. But the Prime Minister can't, or rather won't, answer that question.
This is the Marcia Langton-Tom Calma co-design process. That was under the former Parliament. Is that the sort of model you're in favour of?
There will be ongoing discussion about these.
At some greater detail.
Well, there will be debate, David. There will be, and you're raising it here now, about what form it takes.
But will you make clear what you support in this debate?
David, that is a matter for consultation.
Will it be elected, the body, the voice?
That is up to First Nations people to go through that process.
It falls to the media to hold the government to account for its proposed change. But what if the media has already picked a side?
The challenge for now will be keeping the debate focused on the proposed constitutional change, reassuring Conservatives that Parliament will ultimately determine the shape of the consulting body.
That was Laura Tingle from the ABC, and apparently she thinks it's her job to reassure Conservatives the body will just play a consulting role. See what they do when you start to have a different opinion to Laura Tingle on this issue? It won't be long until you are accused of spreading misinformation. The ABC seems obsessed with pushing the line that details don't matter, and anyone who disagrees is compromised.
All of the detail will be worked out afterwards, because you can't put something in legislation, enshrined in the Constitution. You've got with every I made and every T crossed, and then take it to the public.
And if you yourself insist on asking for detail, you might not just be spreading misinformation, you might actually be a racist, according to this segment broadcast on the ABC.
Quite clearly, the only people asking for detail are people who oppose it. So I think there's 2 very succinct things that you can say about that. One, that it's being railroaded by the Liberal Party because of the rednecks and racists in their own ranks. And 2, that there is enormous amounts of detail there.
And not surprisingly, John Barron, the host, didn't even challenge that fame-hungry academic to justify her disgusting slur. And you know the ABC just loves a free and open debate.
So now we're in the new phase. When do you hope to legislate this question that will be put to the public? And is it possible to go forward to a referendum without public money for a no campaign?
That's a journalist asking the government to dispense with the custom of allocating money to the No campaign because she's worried it might fully inform voters. And it actually got worse, with the ABC painting a very clear picture that if you take issue with the wording of this constitutional amendment, you are immoral and harming Indigenous communities.
Are you worried about a no campaign and the impact that its potential success, obviously referendums are very difficult to pass, may have on your community that has already suffered so much?
What impact might this referendum process have on vulnerable communities, particularly if there is a vocal no campaign?
Yet some are already concerned a no campaign will expose bigoted views and cause further harm to First Nations people.
Community members are already concerned any vote no campaign is going to cause hurt to First Nations people.
So if you disagree with this Labor move, you are racist, spreading misinformation, and are just generally a bad person who hurts Indigenous people. These tactics are manipulative and specifically designed to make it difficult for the average person to simply ask for detail. But if I do that, or you do that, apparently we are just conducting a scare campaign to frighten simple-minded Australians who cannot form opinions on their own.
Yeah, and I think there is a wellspring of support in the community for a hopeful question, for the symbolic gesture of recognising the first Australians in the Constitution. So you're right, you then got to make sure that any of the scare campaigns, that people do understand this so that they're not frightened by it, because it's easy to frighten people. It's easy to knock off referendums or scare campaigns. We've seen that happen before. I think the general population would like to do this, so we have to sort of calm the farm, if you like, calm everyone down around what it actually means and reassure them.
It's not the ABC's job to sell this to the public. It's not the ABC's job to do PR for the government or advocate for the Yes campaign, or any campaign for that matter. And Fran Kelly and all of her taxpayer-funded activists at the ABC might not want you to ask questions about how much power this new body could wield, but we have to. If we all vote yes, this will be enshrined in Constitution. We must know the details prior to a vote, and that is the very essence of what a journalist should do. Otherwise, we might vote for something that looks very different in practice.
When we imagine what a voice would look like, I think it does need to have teeth. It does need to be feared and revered. It needs to be a building. It needs to be an institution that has much more than a voice. It has some control and some autonomy.
But it wasn't recommended by the Uluru Statement.
No, it wasn't. But I think leaving the detail quite opaque in terms of what it could do into the future, what could happen if it goes to the High Court. We've spoken about this, Jan. I think we need to imagine that this body has much more than just an advisory role.
It must be feared and revered? That is a direct quote. I'm not the one conducting a scare campaign here. The ABC has that space covered. Well, let's bring in the panel for this evening. I'm joined by CEO of Recastled, Kosha Garda, and lawyer and commentator Caroline De Russo. Caroline, why don't we start with you? It's a debate that I do think Australians need to have. Do you think the ABC, by clearly picking one side, is hurting Australians from being able to have that debate?
Well, they're definitely trying to gaslight Australians from trying to have a debate. But their view, I think, is a little bit myopic, and I suppose that's not necessarily unusual for the ABC. Look, I did a bit of reading of this over the weekend, and there were articles in both the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald saying, look, we'll get the detail after the referendum. And the comments were extraordinary. And you've got to think the readership of those two mastheads, is much more sympathetic to progressive ideals, a softer left kind of view of the world. And there were a lot of comments on there which said, look, I in principle support the voice, but I'm not going to vote for something I don't understand or I don't know what it is. So I don't think, I think the ABC is writing this quite hard, but I'm not sure whether they've actually read the room as well as what they think they have. The other thing that is interesting with the draft wording that was released on the weekend was when you look at the three paragraphs, the middle paragraph talks about representations made by Indigenous Australians, and then the third paragraph talks about the powers and functions will be determined by Parliament. The second paragraph, by the way that it's drafted, doesn't necessarily restrict the third paragraph. So there's nothing in the drafting that would go into the Constitution, in my view, which would limit this to an advisory body. There's nothing that would limit it to being advice being non-justiciable or not having a veto, all those things that we're being told. I think a little more clarity in what would go into the Constitution, a little bit more detail around it, I suppose would allay some of the concerns that people might have that this ends up being bigger than what people expected in the first place.
Yeah, Kosher, I think Caroline makes such a good point. Journalists were supposed to ask for detail, and now there's this narrative being perpetuated by ABC journalists, and it's a taxpayer-funded programming which is pushing this ideas that you could be racist if you want to know the details. What do you make of that?
Yes, look, I think framing things in moralistic terms sells. That's the fact of the matter. Most people aren't going to read paragraph 3 and understand the nitty-gritty or the policy details around it. And so framing it as something about feel-good gestures, that this is inclusive and it makes us a better country and it protects marginalized communities sounds good. Nobody wants to defy that, and that's kind of why they're doing it. I think the broader point here, Jack, is just the evolution of the media industry, where it has shifted away from being about chronicling or documenting what's happening at both sides of any issue into being one of influence, and often cloaked under the veneer of being chronicling, but it's actually about influence. And therefore, it ups the ante, the responsibility of the opposition side of any issue, this one this week or any others that may come down the pike, to really understand that and combat against that. Because if they rely on the media giving it a fair shake, any issue, the fair shake, that's not going to happen. They've got to get out of the frame of the moralistic terms and really make sure that the people understand in a simple way that makes sense, it's digestible, the process aspect of it, what it means to the Constitution, what the risks are of it setting up these bodies that maybe don't have their scope clearly defined and could see scope creep and bloating in the future and all of that stuff. And I think that's just a challenge that the centre-right increasingly faces.
Yeah, definitely. And look, there could be something to this. I personally haven't made up my mind, but when I've got an ABC journalist telling me I should be afraid, that makes me pause. That makes me think that this whole process should not go ahead.